episode with Amy McKay, we looked at the effect of monetary resources on the outcome of lobbying success, and her data was based on the period 1972 to 1982. One thing she didn't do in her analysis was to take account for the effect of time. It's certainly the case that a previous lobbying effort can have an effect on something that follows after it. And this is in time series analysis called the issue of autocorrelation, and something that Flo and Michael will address in their interview with Will Jennings. Not only does he do time series analysis, but he also does some content analysis, which reveals some interesting issues around coding data from a written format.
My name's Will Jennings. I'm Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at the University of Southampton.
Okay. So can you tell us a bit about your research design that you used in this article? So like, what are your hypotheses and where do they come from?
Okay, so it's driven by two different kind of theoretical ideas, right? And the first is this interest in how government policy agendas reflect the priorities and the concerns of the public, right? Okay. So that's this kind of first idea that I think it really drives the whole thing, right? So the idea is that if government's responsive to kind of, public, this is what democracy is about, public, if the government responds to public concerns. And the second idea, right, is that essentially the nature of decision-making processes and political institutions is going to kind of constrain the ability of government and decision makers to respond. So we draw very heavily on ideas around institutional friction, that policymakers are dealing with a wide range of interests and kind of institutional rules that mean that, if the public suddenly get concerned about an issue, the decision makers can't act. So what we're really trying to do in this article is test those two things. We want to first of all see, does government in the US and the UK respond to public opinion and kind of concern about issues, and how is that structured by institutions?
To what extent did the theory shape the analysis, or was it the other way around, or was it a back and forth process?
I think this research builds on quite kind of a long-standing interest that I have, and my colleague Sean Bevan has as well, in these theoretical questions about how a government responds to public opinion. So I think at the root of it, we'd say that it starts from a theoretical question, which is this kind of interest, and then we look for kind of cases, examples where we can actually test that theory. So I think here the theory is really kind of crucial in setting things up. So we don't start with data and then think, well, what can we look at here? We're really interested in that kind of very broad question about how democracy works.
So you said before that you chose the UK and the US. Why did you pick those two?
There's probably several factors, right? And there are practical factors and there are theoretical factors, right? So the practical kind of factors that any researcher deals with, right, are the my co-author Sean is American, I'm based in the UK, and these are systems that we know a lot about. They're also interesting because they're an interesting contrast of systems, the kind of the US federal presidential system, the UK now is a kind of rather strange political system. I'm not sure it's a hybrid, right? But traditionally you'd say it's a kind of, historically it's been a unitary Westminster majoritarian system. So they're an interesting theoretical contrast. The other reality of why we look at them is simply that the US and the UK are probably the two countries in the world where we have the best data available on public opinion and public attention to issues. So in the US we've got data going back to the kind of 1950s, maybe into 1940s. The UK we've got data on the issues that people are concerned about that go right back to even to the wartime, right to the 1940s, and that gives us a really long time window for us to see how government's behaving and how it's responding to public concern. So there's a whole mix of factors in there that led us to kind of choose those two cases. But ultimately, but those two factors are kind of really important, that kind of comparative design, but also the data.
What is an ECM model? Is it one of several types of time series analysis?
Yeah, so an error correction model, or an ECM, right, it's much easier to say, right, is it's a sort of time series model that is interested in ideas about the equilibrium between two variables of interest, right, or the equilibrating relationship between a variable and other relationships. And where it's really advantageous is it allows us to look at short-term relationship between variables, so whether a change in one variable leads to a change in another, but also the kind of long-term lagged effect of levels. So, for example, if government, if a public opinion is at a high level of concern about an issue, does that lead to a high level of government attention to an issue in the long term. So not only there's kind of that balance of short and long term relationship that's really important, and they're really nice because they capture this equilibrating dynamics in a really kind of intuitive way. So I was always drawn to them because they've got this kind of idea about, if you think about substantively in theoretical terms about the relationship between political variables, that it's not a kind of, we think about how politicians and governments have, they're not kind of perfect linear relationships. They are iterative, a bit like research, right? They're iterative, equilibrating relationships, and error correction models are really nice because they capture that dynamic of this kind of, if there's a shock, how does the system respond? So that's what they do, and they're kind of really nice in that sense. Methodologically, they're also really good, and the reason I like them for a time series perspective, that they're similar to other models, but they're really good at dealing with problems with serial autocorrelation, so the autocorrelation of errors, which is kind of the correlation of errors over time. But they're really good because they control for the kind of lagged values, but also change as the dependent variable. So they're really good in that sense for actually making sure that we don't have those sorts of kind of problems with autocorrelation that might actually influence and kind of distort some of our inferences.
Just going back to when you said that there was good data on the two cases that you used, why did you pick the 1951 to 2003? Was that for a similar reason?
Yeah, so essentially, when we chose the cases, partly so we had a very, for overlapping data. So actually, what we were looking at there was we wanted to have the same period of time for the two countries. So we didn't want to kind of have 1944 to 2007 in one country and 1951 to 2001 in another country. We wanted the same period, so we could say, look, we're making inferences about two political systems over the same period of time, the same length of analysis. That what is driving the differences between the cases is that. And that essentially was driven by the availability of data. That actually some of the, I'm trying to recall precisely actually, that I think the US policy agendas data kind of runs further up, and so does the UK. But essentially, the data on public opinion starts in 1951. I'm pretty sure about that. I have to remember precisely. It's one of the data series that starts then, and we had to have that same period, so we didn't kind of come up with any funny conclusions. Were because we had 10 years more in one country than the other.
You make a percentage calculation for the friction, and you use stochastic process methods, which is wondering if you could explain it a bit more.
Okay, so stochastic process methods are a very kind of fancy way of saying that we're interested in distributions of variables and distributions of change. And so the reason we use those, we draw very heavily in the article on the work of Baumgartner and Jones on their kind of punctuated equilibrium theory of policy change. And their work is really all about how political systems process information and recalibrate and lead to policy change. And the idea there is that if you have friction in a political system, you're going to come up with distributions of change that aren't normal, that have very kind of peak distributions. So a lot of incrementalism around the kind of peak, and a lot of kind of fat tails where there are lots of outliers and big disturbances where you kind of break through the threshold and there's something political change. And so what stochastic process methods are doing are just very simply diagnosing the distribution of a variable. So for us, we look at the kind of distribution of change in these dependent variables in the kind of budgets or in speeches to say how is change in attention to different issues allocated. Okay, we're not interested in kind of differences over time. We're just interested in, are there a lot of big changes or are there a lot of little changes? Are there some moderate changes? So the stochastic process method we use to kind of diagnose these kind of distributions to get a sense of how change is organised. The stochastic process methods are a really good way of looking at distribution of change. The percentage method, again, is just a kind of complicated way of saying that what we're looking at is we're interested in, you could look at kind of change in attention to an issue over time as just being a kind of net measure. So say, for example, the government spends half of its time in a particular year paying attention to the issue of the economy, okay? And then you see in the next year it kind of spends 25% of its time looking at its attention talking about the economy. And you'd say, well, that's a reduction of 25%. Or you might say the percentage method is basically saying if you have that reduction from 50% of its time talking about an issue to 25% of its time talking about an issue, that's actually a kind of 50% decrease in the amount of time it's spent talking about an issue. So that's what that method is doing. The reality is actually, if you looked at kind of of net change, the kind of non-percentage method, you'd find similar sorts of things. It's just, I think what that percentage method is useful for us actually is it tells you more information about, say for example, you spend a very small amount of time talking about the environment. Maybe government passes like 1% of its laws about the environment in a given year, and the next year it spends 5% of its kind of legislative timetable on the environment. In kind of net terms, that's pretty small, right, compared to the economy or whatever. But actually, for the environment, that's a huge change, right? If in the UK, right, you have 5 acts of parliament on the environment, where in the past year you had 1, that's a big shift. So the percentage method is actually giving you this sense that that's a really big change, and that's why we use it in the analysis. Even though I think actually you get the same inferences regardless, it's got that nice kind of theoretical grounding.
Can you talk to us a bit more about agenda share and how you calculated it, how it was coded, were there any issues with it? Because we found that maybe if they'd mentioned a certain topic once, it would be coded in a different way, but the whole speech might be about that part of the agenda. And how did you...
Okay, well, so some of this comes down to kind of how you code issue content,
Yeah.
right? So, and it varies depending on the sort of agenda, right? So what we've got here in this paper is we've got budgets, we've got laws, and we've got speeches, okay? And speeches in some ways are the most difficult thing to code because you've got basically statements from the executive, so whether it's the President of the State of the Union or the Queen's speech where the government's laying out its agenda, where you might have a sentence where essentially a government's talking about several issues, right? So, but what our measure of agenda share is doing is saying basically how much of this speech is about the economy. So when the government's presenting its agenda in the Queen's speech, how much of the kind of the sentences, how much of the kind of the content is referring to the economy, how much is referring to the environment. So for example, and what we're doing then is you're calculating a measure of basically, say there are kind of within that speech you can have 50 mentions of different policy issues.
Okay.
What we're saying is basically if there are 5 mentions of the environment and there are 20 mentions of the economy, well, the environment's getting 10% of the agenda, the economy is getting 40%, and the 50% is some other issue. So the agenda share measure is giving us this relative measure of how much time in that speech or in the legislative timetable, for example, is the government giving to an issue. And it's actually quite useful because it gives you a kind of sense of relative priority. So, say for example, you have one speech in a given year which is really short, right? So say for example, the Queen's speech is like 30 sentences long, but the government spends half of it talking about the environment. It's 15 sentences or 15 quasi-sentences, we call them, right? That's 50% of the time it's talking about it. But if you have a speech that's 150 sentences long, but has got kind of 15 mentions of the environment, and that's just 10%, well, that kind of share, that proportion share is going to be much smaller as a kind of relative proportion. So that's what we're doing with the agenda share. It's kind of capturing, if assuming that time is scarce and how much time government talks about an issue or how much time it legislates an issue, how much of it is that relative to other issues?
Also from your findings, we were wondering, were there any issues about kind of a rhetoric action gap? So it's kind of easy, you might say, for politicians to say things but then actually not take any action on them. What would that affect that have in your research?
Well, I think that what the effect, I mean, it's something we've looked at in other work, is actually about how those speeches translate into legislative action. Here, what really kind of how it influences things is that essentially you expect different patterns of change, right? So it's not, responsiveness is part of the story, right? But essentially, we expect policymakers to have less institutional friction in speeches because there aren't kind of institutional constraints around what you can talk about in the speech, right? You might have kind of cognitive friction that policymakers are always obsessed with particular issues compared to other issues, but essentially, you know, when the government's writing its speech in a given week, and although there are departments kind of wanting to have their share of the Queen's speech or whatever, there are actually no kind of institutional constraints, right? The government could decide, actually, you know what, we're going to have 5 sentences talking about defence, right? We just need to do it. And so that is where that kind of friction comes into the kind of affecting the findings, that we actually find the levels of friction, the kind of the responsiveness of government policy agendas to public opinion are structured by that level of friction, and that's what matters. I think I answered the question.
Yeah. So when you say mention, does that mean you kind of had a list of words that would be associated with, say, the environment or the economy, and then you...
Yeah, no. So what we have is we have this kind of we have a kind of policy content coding system around 19 different major topics, right? And they're very intuitive things like health, the economy, housing, the environment, energy, and so forth. So actually, if you look at the list and it's listed in the paper, they're very intuitive topics that we all say, yeah, that's a policy issue, right? So, and what we then have is a code book underneath that of the sorts of things that would be associated with a mention of the environment. And it is quite complicated, right? Because there are certain things that, for example, you might say, is that an energy issue? Is that an environment issue? But what we have is, because this is all part of a very big comparative project, which is now spanning, I think, it's about 15 to 20 countries, where people are coding the policy content of government agendas, whether they're laws, speeches, whatever, using the same content coding system. So we're able to compare data from Denmark, Spain, and the UK, and say this is comparable data. And part of that is, there's a challenge that we have coders who've worked on the project for so many years that we double code things, so you have two coders working on it, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's Sean or other colleagues, but then we reconcile them and we look where there's agreement, and basically if you and I code something as the environment, we say, well, it's probably the environment, and if you and I kind of say something, well, I say that's environment, you say it's energy, we then, when we're doing the coding reconciliation, we'll say, well, why did you think it was energy? Why did I think it was environment? And we discuss that. So it's this coding system that we've come up with that's been kind of used in, I think, hundreds of articles now. But we use to kind of code the content, and we look at the kind of that content to say how much of the government's time is it spending legislating on those issues.
You mentioned quasi-sentences already. Can you just, how do you identify such a sentence in your practice?
So the definition that quasi-sentences came out of this big project called the Comparative Manifestos Project, which was an even bigger project than the Comparative Agendas Project. In some senses, it was kind of based around huge numbers of countries looking at manifestos to look at the promises that parties are making in their party platforms. And what a quasi-sentence is a kind of a unit of it's like a unit of an idea or a kind of a sentence or a bullet point or some kind of discrete component which is talking about a bit of a policy. It's one of these things that you can say, well, it's a bit difficult to explain it, you'll know it if you see it, right? But basically, it can be differentiated by punctuation, by a bullet point, or, for example, other just kind of grammatical structures, right? So what a quasi-sentence might be, so say, for example, in the Queen's speech, I'm saying, the Queen says, my government will legislate on health, on the NHS, on regulating recycling and welfare for the armed forces. Okay, and you look at that and you say, well, that's a sentence because you've got commas in, but you break it apart and you say, well, there's the first mention is the first issue, right? Then you've got this kind of, then there's a comma, right? And then there's a second issue, and but it will vary, right? So a full sentence might just be about the NHS, and you might say that's the quasi-sentence, that's about that. But you might have a sentence that actually contains several bits of policy content. So it will vary, and that's the nice thing about quasi-sentences. They allow you that flexibility, so you don't have to. If you get a sentence that deals actually with a couple of policy issues, you aren't in this kind of horrible situation where you have to say, is this more health or is it more welfare? I'm not sure. You can actually say, well, these are kind of, we can break them up into kind of two discrete things.
Makes a lot of sense. So just to be a bit broader about the method, why did you choose to use time series analysis, and then what benefits does this have in general, not just necessarily for the project? Okay, so
a lot of the work I do is based on time series analysis. I think that time series analysis is underused by people, I think, partly because it's kind of quite a niche method, but it's actually, I think it's one of the most important methods, and that's because most things that we observe in the world and kind of social data are organised in structure and time, okay? And one of the big issues with looking at things in time is that we can look at things in terms of trends and dynamics, and we have all these sorts of concepts that we're interested in that are about time. But one of the big issues about dealing with data that's organised and structured in time is that observations are correlated between time, okay? And this violates some of the very basic assumptions of regression analysis, right? Because essentially the biggest predictor of your political attitudes or my political attitudes are our political attitudes yesterday and the day before and the day before. And if you and when you're looking at data that's structured in time, if we don't take account for that, our errors can become correlated over time, and we can kind of have models that look incredibly good but are incredibly kind of biased, right? And kind of, so for example, like a classic problem in looking at kind of the standard regression analysis of time series data, right, is that essentially if you have two variables that are trending together, right, it could be things that are completely related, right? It could be kind of over a period of time, kind of production of the soap industry and percentage of people voting, right? Is that because those two things are trending, I could probably run your regression and show you there's a significant relationship between soap and time, right? And if we don't deal with time properly, we come up with completely spurious relationships. So that's why I use time, because it's kind of, I use time series analysis. You have to properly control for that temporal dependence of variables. And additionally, as I kind of said earlier, that I think it's also really interesting because it gives you insight theoretically into the dynamic relationship between variables. So if you consider that politics isn't a one-shot game where people just have attitudes at a fixed moment in time, but it's actually about dynamic responses and people's responses to shocks, to exogenous information, to new information, then you have to look at things dynamically and you have to do something with time.
But how do you make that distinction between contemporaneous effects and the effects that are lacked from the past?
So I mean, the really great thing in time series analysis, we can specify in our models just is short run and long run effects, right? So we can say, for example, in an error correction model, for example, we can have the dependent variable is change, okay, and then we can look at the effect of, say, for example, change in public opinion on change in the amount of attention the government's giving to a policy issue. But at the same time, you can have control for the previous value of public concern about the issue in the previous time period, and you can also control for the government's previous attention to the issue, right? So the really great thing with time series analysis just there is that, you know, we could run a regression where I said, well, public opinion is predicts the amount of attention the government's spending on health, and you'd say yes, but of course the other thing that's predicting how much time the government's spending talking about health is how much it talked last year about health. And that's what we're doing with the lag variables that we can actually control. So we say, controlling for the fact that the government talked a lot about health last year, and the public was very concerned about health last year, how much has suddenly the public's become even more concerned about health this year? Has this led to a change in the amount of the government's talk about health? So that kind of those short run and long run effects are really nice ways of actually kind of understanding the dynamic relationship.
So could you please explain equation 1 on page 30?
Of course. So that's the kind of the equation 1 is really kind of the meat and drink of the analysis, right? So this is the error correction model. So what we've got here is we've got, as our dependent variable on the left hand side, we've got change in the attention to a particular issue, a change in the policy agenda, right? So change in the amount of attention that government's giving to an issue. On the right hand side, we have a series of variables, right? We have the lag dependent variable, right? So past values of the policy agenda kind of in the previous time period. We then have change in the independent variable, change in public attention to the issue, and the lag level of public attention to the same issue. Okay, so that's the kind of those four variables is kind of part of the equation, the classic, what we call a single equation error correction model. Okay, so you've got the dependent variable being the change, and then the kind of on the right hand side the change of the dependent variable, the lag level of the dependent variable, and change and lag of the independent variable. Very simple, kind of nice parsimonious setup, and then all we've got additional to that is we've got a control that controls for the party in power. So essentially again, this is theoretically grounded, but the idea is that governments to the left or right, kind of Labour and Conservative governments, or kind of Republican and Democrat governments, will talk more or less about particular issues, right? Because of ideas around issue ownership. So the idea that maybe Labour's going to talk more about health, the Tories going to talk more about defence. Well, we control for that. So we say actually, we will control for basically that level difference that maybe the parties talk about different issues, and that party control is just is this kind of fixed level control that we control for. And that's very simply that kind of equation 1. That kind of captures those equilibrating dynamics. So the lag-dependent variable, this lag of the agenda, the interpretation of that in the analysis actually is that it's in the error correction model, that should be negative, because that's basically when there's a shock, so it increases, say the kind of the policy attention to health goes up, well the equilibrating dynamic should be that it should be negative because it returns to its long-run equilibrium. So the idea is that basically there's a big shock to one issue, it's going to come back towards equilibrium the next time period. So that's a very simple, that's why the reason I really like error correction models, they're really kind of intuitive, parsimonious models, and they kind of capture that kind of quite complicated thing in quite a parsimonious, simple way.
So one of the things we came across is to do with budget. So there are some issues perhaps about using budget as a dependent variable. So like in the US, the budget for education is devolved. So how did you counter those issues in your research, and was there another dependent variable you could have used instead?
Budgets are one of the kind of the most horrible data and variables you can ever use, and I assure you that, it's actually, there are big issues with budgetary data in terms of categorization. So if you go and look at official statistics in the US or the UK, the problem with budget data is that functional descriptions of data vary over time. So actually, it's a bit like kind of things like inflation or unemployment, that the rules about counting the variable change over time. But essentially, so in budgets, you have an issue that maybe what was defined as kind of agriculture last year suddenly gets put in the environment budget this year because we've got something there. All I can say on that is that the way that we dealt with that as part of these larger projects, so for example, the US policy agendas data has been generated on a very careful functional coding of functional budgets in the US system. So if you go and look at the original data set on the US policy agendas website, we're using 19 categories in our budgetary data. Their original raw data set of functional data from the US, the Office of Management and Budget, is vast, and it's very messy because there's all these different things. So you aggregate, right? And so that's how we cope with those issues. What I would say is actually that when you aggregate across, it's true that, for example, there are some kind of knife edge issues around how you would categorize a particular issue, or maybe this is devolved spending that goes to another kind of area. But essentially, when we're aggregating up, say, around education, what we know is that those are budgets, those are kind of funds that are being allocated to that issue, and in some sense in the paper we're not dealing with this question of actually who gets the money and where does it go and which department spends it, but this is kind of what the classification of what is being spent on a particular issue at a particular point in time. So I'd probably say, sometimes budgetary data is quite contentious, but I'm kind of, I'm moderately confident in it. I'm confident in the inferences we draw from the data.
As similar with speeches, there are other ways that the executive can set the agenda for the public. Did you consider adding anything to the speeches?
Yeah, no, it's a kind of these questions that is kind of, you think, well, are there better measures of executive agendas? And it is true that I think speeches are a very good measure of the kind of headline, rhetorical way in which the executive sets out its programme for the year ahead. And maybe there are other measures, for example, like cabinet minutes or so forth, that give you a different sense of the sorts of decisions that are getting taken by the executive on a week-to-week basis. The real challenge in all these things is essentially that you need measures that are continuous and kind of interpretable in the same way over time. Okay, and actually that's really challenging for kind of long-term analysis because essentially, say for example, kind of press releases, right? If you want to analyse what the government's doing, kind of in terms of press releases now compared to what it was doing in the 1950s, there's a whole argument that actually it's just very different systems. Or maybe a press release in the 1950s, maybe there's not many of them, or they can be good measures. So that's a big issue, right? And so what, ultimately we look at speeches because they are actually really fascinating, kind of these executive speeches, that they are very consistent in the format of the time. They change very little. If you go and look at the kind of the Queen's speech, aside from the kind of the slight subtle differences in the kind of the grandiosity of the language, right? If you go back to 1911 and the way policies are introduced, sometimes you couldn't tell apart the government talking about its policy agenda in 1911 compared to the government talking about its policy agenda in 2008. And it performs exactly the same functional purpose, right? And the same with the State of the Union. So they're kind of measures that provide us a good continuous indicator of the priorities of the executive. And as with all these things, they're never going to be perfect, but they are at least kind of a consistent and stable measure. And that's kind of the kind of minimum that you can hope for when you're looking at some kind of measure of government priorities and agendas.
So one thing that stuck out for us was kurtosis. We'd like to talk a bit more about that. Can you first of all just explain what exactly it is?
What is kurtosis? Right. So the idea around kurtosis is, it's very, as I kind of said earlier, it's heavily linked with theories of punctuated equilibrium, right? And kurtosis is about the shape of distributions. Okay, so your kind of normal distribution is the classical kind of bell curve, right? And kurtosis gives you an indication of the peakiness of a distribution, right? And this is kind of why it's relevant, right? So the reason it's relevant is that distributions are really interesting because they give us a sense about the underlying dynamics that produce data, right? The underlying dynamics that produce the particular dependent variable. And kurtosis is a measure that tells you when it's very high, it tells you the distribution is very peaked, right? And what a very peaked distribution has a very slender narrow peak, right? That basically is way above, where there's a lot of kind of incrementalism at around 0, right? Or whatever the mean of the distribution is. And then it has fat tails, right? So that basically these kind of large disturbances that are way beyond the kind of the mean, kind of outside the mean, right? That are way disproportionate to the kind of central tendency of the distribution, and very kind of thin, kind of weak shoulders of the distribution, right? So the idea there is that there isn't much moderate change. You either have no change or a lot of change, right? Or kind of really big change. So kurtosis is a really good way of diagnosing how a particular variable, whether it's public opinion, whether it's policy, is distributed. And so kurtosis then is interlinked with all this kind of the work of Jones and Baumgartner initially, but other people now, that says if you've got friction in the institutional system, or cognitive friction in people's kind of heads when they're thinking about issues, you would expect to see this kind of friction is manifested in high incrementalism, so very little change. That if the members of the public, right, are kind of take a lot of something to become a really big issue for us to change our concern about an issue, you'd expect us from year to year not to change what we're concerned about very much, right? But suddenly you get a massive event like the global financial crisis, and everything changes, and we all completely change our responses to these questions about what the most important problem facing the country is. Well, that's kurtosis is telling you that, because you've got very small amounts of change and massive shift, where suddenly we didn't care about the economy at all, but then that's for us the biggest thing. So that's what kurtosis is, and it kind of is. It's a very simple diagnostic statistic, but it's completely interlinked with the theory.
Okay, so kurtosis can help diagnose friction in your results.
Yeah, so that's the inference is that the kurtosis tells you when you're having these very large changes and also high levels of incrementalism. There is an argument. Well, maybe there's something about distributions that's not the same as friction, but we actually think that it's an indicator of either cognitive friction, that decision makers are just a very kind of unresponsive to change and suddenly change, or it's institutional rules, right? For example, the fact that maybe it's you might have institutional friction in the sense that it's quite difficult to legislate on an issue, but then you suddenly have to do it because the issue becomes so important. So that's what you use kurtosis to diagnose.
As part of the interviews, we always ask the scholar to explain just one figure in the table, because politics students often struggle with numbers and charts and graphs.
Yeah.
But could you then explain figure 1?
So in figure 1, what we're doing is we're looking at a histogram of the frequency of percentage changes in government attention to issues. Okay, so what we're looking at there is how often across that particular agenda does the attention to all issues kind of change by 5%, 100%, 200%, right up to 900% at the end of the graph, and minus 100%, right? So basically it goes from something to nothing, right? So government stops talking about an issue altogether. So what we're looking at there is how changes in policy attention are distributed. Okay, so the histogram's giving you that peaked distribution, right? So you see where is the central tendency of the distribution, right? Is it around 0? Okay, is it slightly to the right? Okay, kind of what's the kind of the mean of the distribution? What's the actual kind of distribution itself shaped like? And we've on that, I think it's really intuitive. We superimpose what a normal distribution, given the mean and the standard deviation of the distribution, would look like, right? And that's where you really get the sense of this idea about what kurtosis tells you, because you can see that in every distribution there is this big slender tip that goes right through the normal distribution, and there's lots of emptiness, of kind of white space under where the shoulders of the distribution should be, and there are some kind of large changes at the end. And so that's what figure 1 is doing. It's basically saying that kurtosis figure, it's giving you the visual representation of that kurtosis figure.
The question, if you were going to do the research again, is there anything you would change, anything you regret doing or would do differently?
Okay, this is like the politician's question where they say, I did everything perfectly. I think, what would we do differently? Well, okay, so the one thing I think we could do, and I think it's true of a lot of the work we do on kind of policy responsiveness, would be that I think we don't include enough exogenous measures of problem status, right? So real world problems that are driving the process, right? So what we're observing here is kind of statistical responsiveness. So what we see is that, oh, the economy becomes an issue, well, the government starts talking about the economy. Well, actually, how about maybe the fact the economy is becoming an issue is influencing both the public and the policymakers at the same time? And I think, so where this research could could really expand is where we kind of take a more sophisticated model that looks at the kind of the lagged interrelationship as a system of equations, right, between real world problems, the public and the government, to look at actually that dynamic in more complicated ways. So I think that if you would ask me what I would do, I think where this research needs to go in this kind of whole agenda, I think it needs to have that more kind of nuanced view of actual real world problems, who's driving who, and so that we can really with confidence say actually this is government responding to the public, as opposed to the government looking like it's responding to the public, but actually just responding to policy problems and the kind of the public are a spectator of some sort. Okay.
The first important lesson from the interview with Will Jennings is that error correction models, they deal with this thing called autocorrelation, which is the way in which the past influences the future outcome of a variable. They allow us to have robust standard errors taking into account short-term and long-term effects of time. I think the second lesson that we can learn from the interview with Will Jennings is that we shouldn't be scared of equations. When I first saw the ECM equation, I thought it looked very complicated, but the minute it was explained to me what all the different parameters meant, it made perfect sense. And basically it's just a slightly more complicated form of a regression model that allows us to account for the effects of time. The third thing that struck me is the difficulty of accurately measuring public opinion and also accurately measuring the agenda share. Public opinion was measured using a survey question about which is the most important issue. These were then recoded into categories that fit a broader project, and perhaps some detail got lost in the nuances of people's meanings around what their most important issue is. Secondly, agenda share. That's really tricky to measure because they were using content analysis here to identify how much of the agenda, say in a government speech, is all about the most important issues, and that's a really difficult thing to disentangle. I'm not sure that they've done a perfect job, but neither am I convinced that it is possible to do a perfect job. So again, this is highlighting some of the compromises we have to make when measuring social and political phenomena. Then there's the issue of kurtosis, which is basically the idea of peakiness. So it's the idea that a variable may have very little attention until one particular time when there is a sudden peak, and the error correction models allows us to deal with this and to not assume that there is a straightforward linear relationship. After all of that complicated analysis using equations that are at first sight difficult to understand, the authors in the end turn back to the use of histograms to illustrate some of their data. I find this really interesting that they should turn to histograms. They really do help illustrate a point and can help with the interpretation of a complex statistical method.